Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you to Jennifer and Robin for organizing the symposium and for inviting me to participate. Zoos represent an environment in which human and non-human animals, and from here on in I'll be referring to humans and animals just for simplicity. It's an environment in which humans and animals may come together in much closer proximity than they would in nature, and interactions of all sorts are common as a result. Now, if you look up the definition of a zoo, there are many different definitions. Here's one from History of Zoological Gardens in the West, which is somewhat ominous, I think. But in this case, a zoo is defined as a place of forced meeting between animal and human. Well, there is certainly truth to that, in that the animals may not be able to freely come and go and control that meeting or interaction. Norton et al. Alternatively defined zoos a bit more optimistically as professionally managed zoological institutions having a collection of living animals used for conservation, scientific studies, public education, and public display. The emphasis on scientific studies here is mine, as zoos are often overlooked as venues for research, but they can and have contributed tremendously, particularly in areas of animal behavior and human-animal interaction. So the zoo environment offers an opportunity to ask questions about how human presence may influence animal behavior. It's important to bear in mind that in the wild, too, humans and non-humans may come together. If we have animals that are habituated to observe a presence, for example, as arguably many zoo animals are, as well as animals at established field sites, there may be an influence on behavior. Animals that are habituated for tourists are equally influenced by humans, oftentimes to the detriment of the animals. So the zoo isn't a completely different environment, but rather somewhere on a continuum of human-animal interaction and influence. In 2000, Jeff Hosey published a seminal paper on human-animal interactions and relationships in the zoo, in which he applied research that had been done in animal agriculture to the zoo environment. He noted that a relationship develops from a series of interactions, events in which the behavior of one individual aims to elicit a response in another, although it may not actually do so. A relationship may develop from a series of repeated interactions. In the zoo environment, animals have the opportunity to interact with two categories of humans: familiar, that is, keepers and other zoo staff, and unfamiliar, zoo guests. Relationships may develop with familiar individuals but are unlikely to develop with unfamiliar individuals, given that relationships are built upon a series of repeated interactions. In general, zoo guests, that is, unfamiliar humans, may have a positive impact on animals. They may serve as enrichment or novelty. On the other hand, they may have a negative impact and be a stressor, inducing behavioral changes and physiological stress responses. Finally, they may be a neutral stimulus, with animals habituating and eventually ignoring guests. Zoos also offer a rich opportunity to observe animals over a long period of time, up close, with extensive information on animals' backgrounds, rearing history, relatedness, and the ability to access and measure physiological variables related to health, maturation, and life history. Because many variables can't be controlled in the zoo setting, it's vital to establish and maintain long-term monitoring of behavior, much in the same way that is done at long-term field sites. And in practice, this isn't really functionally any different from long-term field studies, but there are some important caveats. Researchers are oftentimes constrained to observe only during regular zoo hours. The activity of the animals may be similarly constrained by zoo practices and procedures. But, much like the field, there are many factors that we simply cannot control. And so collecting data over long periods of time allows us to answer questions and to respond to unexpected changes in ways that are both productive and informative. From the perspective of the zoo, there's tremendous benefit in monitoring behavior. Well over a decade ago, I co-authored a paper on the value of behavioral monitoring. It's used widely across many institutions in much the same way that a zoo might monitor health, body weight, or food consumption. In this sort of use, monitoring can be used to enhance welfare and make evidence-based husbandry decisions, but it can also be used for solid research. While we need to recognize limitations of zoo-based research, lack of control over many variables, for example, the unique aspects of the zoo environment, there are many ways that monitoring data can allow us to address questions that would be difficult, if not impossible, to answer in the wild, that focus on the impact of the zoo environment, including human presence, and how unpredictable or unplanned changes may influence behavior. I want to talk about several examples that help to illustrate this point. Moving individuals from one zoo to another or one group to another is common practice in zoos. Unlike nature, these decisions are usually made for the animals, not by the animals. And while oftentimes decisions are made well in advance, at times such changes in group composition happen unexpectedly. An animal dies or is born or moves on short notice. It can be impossible to evaluate how that change impacts behavior unless you're already doing behavioral monitoring. In this case, you already have your baseline, your pre-behavior measure, so to speak. This allows you to evaluate how a particular change has impacted behavior and more. For example, you can monitor infant development more closely in order to determine if an infant is developing at an appropriate pace. Are they reaching certain key milestones at specific ages? You can evaluate how well an individual is integrating into a new group, for example. In most cases, of course, having that pre-behavior period is simply not available unless you have a behavioral monitoring program in place. In 2002, the silverback at Brookfield Zoo passed away. Although we didn't have any baseline data, we knew that we would have some time before a new silverback was introduced to the group. Despite intensive observations, we wound up having about 5 weeks in which to collect data before a new silverback was introduced. And although we were able to compare behavior before and after the introduction of the new silverback, we had 6 times as much data after the introduction of the silverback as we did before. Nevertheless, we did still find some significant patterns, most notably an increase in female-female affiliative behavior after the new silverback was introduced, not before. But without a baseline, it was really difficult to evaluate or interpret these patterns fully. Thanks to long-term fieldwork, we're now able to begin to address key questions that require years or even decades of data to address. Zoos represent an amazing storehouse of such data. We know exactly how old most zoo animals are. We know when they breed, successfully or not. We know their social groupings, their physical environments. We know a lot of information about every individual animal in the zoo environment. Now we need to make use of these data. One example of this is research on reproductive aging. Most of this work was done with my collaborator, Dr. Sylvia Atsalis, when we worked at Brookfield Zoo, but some of it extended for a long period of time after that. Because animals in zoos oftentimes live to much older ages than their wild counterparts, phenomena that are unlikely to occur in the wild, reproductive cessation, for example, may actually occur. Sylvia and I were able to study hormonal and behavioral patterns in 30 gorillas, with over 20 of them considered geriatric. These figures illustrate progesterone concentrations in several gorillas representing different age categories. What we found is that younger females in the upper panel here were cycling normally. All of the younger females we evaluated had hormone profiles like this, very clear patterns, very consistent cycle lengths. About 3/4 of the older or geriatric females were cycling, and this is in the middle panel here, though the cycle lengths were much more variable. Most interesting in the lower panel, about 1/4 of the geriatric females were acyclic. That is, there is no indication of cyclicity in these females. And they weren't necessarily the oldest animals in the sample, with non-cyclers as young as 38 and cyclers as old as 48. And because we know so much about these individuals, we were able to continue to track them even after our study ended. Obviously, most of these females have since passed on, and we were able to follow up and get necropsy reports on these females and found several interesting things. Now, although we did not know the reproductive status for many of these females at the time of their death, we did know their age at death and their age the last time we looked at their cycling patterns. First, we found that older females were far more likely to show signs of reproductive tract pathologies than were younger females, and that's consistent with what one might find in menopausal humans, for example. Second, we found that females tended to die within a few years of their menopause or reproductive termination. That is, a female who was menopausal at 38 probably died at 40. A female who was menopausal at 50 probably died at 52. So although in theory a female could have a lengthy post-reproductive lifespan, given that there were females in the population living well into their 50s and females as young as 38 who were not cycling, it actually seems that they don't. Reproductive terminations occur quite late in a gorilla's life. I don't know that it would be possible to track this sort of thing in a wild population. Probably the area in which the human-animal interface is most clearly and explicitly demonstrated in the zoos and therefore evaluated is in the area of visitor effects. As I mentioned earlier, there's a large body of research exploring the ways in which the human presence may influence or impact the behavior of animals in the zoo, and whether or not this impact is positive or negative. The interactions can go in the opposite direction as well, though. That is, the behavior of animals may influence the behavior of visitors. So we did a study exploring these two proposed directions of interaction using very high-profile species, big cats at Brookfield Zoo. What we found is that visitor presence, that is, number of people at an exhibit, did not lead to changes in behavior, but the behavior of the animals, specifically whether they were active or not, did lead to increased crowds, for several species at least, and in some cases changes in visitor behavior. There were definite species differences, with the larger cats, lion, Amur leopard for example, and Amur tiger, showing much greater effects, and the smaller cats, in this case fishing cat and clouded leopard, which were housed indoors, showing the smallest effect. Nonetheless, the fact that we did not find a significant impact of visitors on animal behavior suggests that visitors were not a stressor, but neither were they particularly enriching or positive for the animals. More recently, I was able to explore the impact of the complete absence of visitors on behavior, in this case of the gorilla group at the Buffalo Zoo during the COVID pandemic. Now, I point out that this was only possible because of the long-term behavioral monitoring data that existed. Given that most, if not all, zoos were closed to the public for a minimum of 4 months, and many much longer than that, there was of course an unprecedented opportunity to really evaluate the visitor effect. Does the complete absence of humans impact animal behavior, and if so, how? There were loads of anecdotal reports of zoo animals being bored, but also reports of animals being more relaxed and breeding for the first time in many years. Zoos were so overwhelmed during this time and understaffed due to COVID that it was largely impossible to try and mount any solid scientific investigations of this event. I was able to find one study that attempted to examine this absence of visitor effect, but there were no baseline observations, only observations for a limited period of time, and that is about 5 observation days per animal exhibit during the shutdown compared to after the shutdown when the zoo reopened. The results were varied based on species, but by and large, no changes in behavior were really detected. During the shutdown, I was fortunate enough to be granted access to the Buffalo Zoo's webcams. This allowed me to conduct my normal behavioral monitoring observations when there were no visitors present. Rather than compare this to their behavior after the zoo reopened, I was able to compare it to the same time period the previous year. I did this research with my former students, Megan Miller and Kaylee Robinson, And we found that largely the gorillas did not alter their behavior significantly, though there was a lot of individual variation that could have obscured such patterns. This graph shows the differences from 2019 to 2020 separately for each gorilla. All of the animals, except for the adult silverback, who's illustrated in the upper panel here, showed a noticeable increase in foraging in 2020. The silverback also spent significantly less time auto-grooming and scratching in 2020. Scratching is commonly considered a stress-related behavior in primates. This suggests that for the silverback at least, absence of visitors had a positive impact on behavior. Anecdotally, I can tell you that the younger animals in the group, once the zoo reopened, spent considerable time at the visitor viewing windows. They do often interact with visitors in a positive manner, so it suggests that visitors may be enriching for some individuals in the group and a stressor for others. So what can we take away from these sorts of studies? First, monitoring behavior should be a routine, critical aspect of zoo operations. It facilitates more evidence-based decision-making, permits behavior to be systematically considered in decisions, and facilitates research, particularly when unexpected or unplanned events occur. Second, we need to consider the bidirectionality of interaction. Visitors may impact animals, but the animals may impact visitors as well. Third, not all human-animal interactions are equivalent in the zoo. Interactions with familiar individuals, primarily keepers and caretakers, may lead to establishment of strong relationships based on a series of interactions, whereas unfamiliar visitors generally don't generate such relationships. Fourth, the ability to collect long-term data in zoos with far more detailed information than may be available elsewhere, and the ability to pair this with routine sampling for physiological measures makes zoos a valuable and often undervalued venue for behavioral research. Finally, we need to be mindful that the behavior of humans may have impacts, both positive and negative, on the animals in our care. By educating visitors about how their behavior may impact the animals they're observing, we may be able to reduce negative impacts and enhance positive impacts in an effort to improve the well-being of zoo animals. And with that, I would like to thank my collaborators, my research students, and funding sources for several of these studies. And with that, I would be happy to take questions.